Things are busy. Things are busy, but
Good to hear. And how's the weather?
it snowed here. I know you said you had snow. It snowed here the other day, but it only lasted for half a day, and then it got warmer, and so much of the snow is gone. How about over there?
We had the first sun today for I would say 4 months maybe.
My
So
goodness.
yeah, it's tough. Everybody starts smiling again, and people come to life, and everybody was walking around just enjoying the sun. And in Sweden, when the sun comes out, people are just standing like this to get the sun. It looks really odd.
Soaking it up, eh?
Soaking it up specifically, and they could be standing for half an hour, and it's we've been longing for such a long time. We haven't had sun, and it's such a need for it.
I'm sure there is. I guess, is it worse in Gothenburg than in Stockholm?
Stockholm, it's a bit more north, but it has more clear weather. It's not as cloudy over there.
Okay.
Of course, if you get even further north, they still doesn't even they have the polar night still up north.
Oh yeah.
It's nice now when the spring is coming and you start seeing green things, small ones, leeks,
Little sprouts.
little sprouts coming out.
Yeah, we're seeing a few.
It's
crocuses and
yeah, crocuses. Yes, those are the ones that are coming up slowly. And we have a lovely one. I think it's probably related to the crocuses. It's in Swedish called snowdrip or snowdrop. It has a very small white flower, and I think it's wild, but sometimes people are also sort of putting it.
I think we have those too, yeah. Snowdrops.
Snowdrops, they call them here. It's a lovely name.
Oh yeah.
So we're still getting into the more hopeful season. This is, and of course,
new life, new growth. Yes, renewal.
Renewal, definitely renewal. And mentioning renewal, we've been looking particularly into the renewal of the Lemmingsgate.
Oh yeah.
Trying to get my head around it, and was particularly looking into your lovely book, Self-Evolving Cosmos.
Yep.
And it was chapter 5 that enticed me specifically. I really do like your stress the important discovery of Morrison and Morley of 1887. The sort of first crack in the old worldview.
Oh yeah. That was a big event.
Definitely. And your good description of how odd everything would become when we understand that light, the speed of light is constant. It changes everything.
Yes, it does. And I mean, if you tie that in with what Heidegger said about light, it's very interesting to compare the paradoxes of light in physics with what phenomenological philosophy has to say about light. It's an incredible nexus between those two. Light seems to be central. And in the self-evolving cosmos, I associated the photon with the Klein model. So there's a connection between light and topologically the Klein model. And then the other force particles are associated with the other members of my topological family. And you were mentioning the lemniscate. That's one member of the family, yeah. So in the 2017 paper, I tie it to Taoism.
Oh, yeah.
The yin and yang, and how that actually evolves from nothingness, from the Tao. So it's been wonderful to see how these things fall together. My life's inspiration.
I had a few questions. Is it okay if I put some questions?
Certainly.
Uh,
I was expecting you to.
yes. There is in chapter 5, there is you mentioning the subject and the object, and there is a specific quote from Theophis Ouspensky, I think his name was, and how he sort of by happenstance brings in the what you call it, Newtonian paradigm into the understanding of flatlanders, and misconstrue that the flatlanders cannot see an angle, but they can, for some reason, see the circle, which is even more than an angle. It's 360 degrees. And I think I reached some sort of germinate understanding of what the subject is. I saw this, I have pointed out in thin air, the line and the square, and you use them, I think, as representations of what it could be in the old understanding. And then as the third thing, you bring in the cube. And I think the usual misunderstanding is to make dimension or the cube, you use the areas of the squares, and you sort of construct them to make a cube. And that made me understand, yes, that's how I usually make depth. But then I realized that is not true depth. It's just a variety of the square, the area. I use the area, I use the square to make a cube, like artificial depth. But I realized somewhere that is not true depth. And you pointed out that the part of the cube or the any three-dimensional object, you cannot see those edges and those sides. That's the subject, and it almost came to complete realization that the subject is what is hidden in a way in the normal perspective of line and square.
Yeah, I would say that true depth, I would take that in what Merleau-Ponty says about depth. And I think when we spoke last time, you pointed out that for Merleau-Ponty, depth is the first dimension, that from which the other dimensions arise. And subjectivity plays a role in Merleau-Ponty's concept of depth. But when we talk about squares and lines and cubes, you don't find subjectivity there.
No, no.
And when geometers extrapolate, when they talk about the hypercube, you don't find subjectivity there either. It's just an extrapolation of the objectified versions of geometry that we're familiar with, right? So we have the point, the line, the square, the cube, and the hypercube. And in conventional geometry, all of those are objectified. There's no trace of subjectivity. It's only with Merleau-Pontian depth that subjectivity enters the picture, but it enters the picture in such a way that it is merged with objectivity. So it isn't subject versus object.
No.
Not like we've gone from objects and now we just have subject. It's an integration of subject and object. And I think Heidegger did the same, and it's likely that Merleau-Ponty was influenced by Heidegger with that.
When I read that, I came to think of something that is pretty common to refer to and to quote, and that's Jean Piaget, the child psychiatrist or psychologist.
Sure.
And he invented this neologism, object constancy. And it in every psychology book you can find this concept, especially when it goes to developmental psychology.
Sure.
And I was thinking when I read your chapter that something has felt odd with his description of what he calls object constancy. And the whole idea that the child needs to feel with its fingers backside of, let's see, any object that has depth, and then extrapolate from the surfaces. And at a certain time, the child only, for some reason, should have, he assumed, only surfaces and lines and points. And then went one step, almost like the development with the geometers in ancient Egypt or Greece, made this very abstract extrapolation from those, and then realized the object. Eureka, here comes the object.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounded odd. I had to accept it because I didn't have any thinking to contradict it. But it didn't feel right. But when I read your this chapter in your book here, I realized that it's not how you learn depth. You don't learn it in that way. Depth is there all the time, and it's more and more development. It's not like at a singular moment you have objects constancy. I think that's like projecting geometry in a very abstract way to a child's development.
Mm.
That's what I thought.
You know, David Bohm wrote about psychological issues like that, object constancy
Oh,
and the like. There's a section at the end of a book he wrote called this, I think that book was The Special Theory of Relativity, if I'm not mistaken, where he talks about developmental psychology and psychological issues. So he has some interesting things to say about it as well. I'm going to take a look
yeah, please.
at my chapter 5, so I'm focused on what you're focused on. Yeah, the dimensional family of topological spinners.
Yes.
Okay, let me check it out. Okay, so this is just basically presenting those structures, that family. I didn't remember that that's what chapter 5 dealt with, so I'm just refreshing my memory. So yeah. So that was your question.
Yeah, I'm afraid there were follow-up questions from the same chapter.
Sure.
Um,
Well, first of all, did I answer your question?
yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
It's also the when this is like two-part question, and it makes sense to me. I cannot properly verbalize it that the subject is the covered thing, and I think Heidegger calls that the filia, the thing that is not uncovered. And
Hans, can you raise your voice just a little bit?
yeah, of course, definitely. I can get closer here too. Close. Can you hear me clearer now?
I can hear you louder, yeah.
Okay.
I think there's still a little, the audio is still not 100% clear. It's loud enough, but it's not, but it's clear enough. So let's proceed.
Okay. I'll try to keep my voice as loud as possible. They usually say in Sweden I have a sergeant major's voice. I try to keep it down. I was actually sergeant in the army.
Ah,
But
I hope you're not going to put me through boot camp.
I'm going for Stephen M. Rosen's boot camp of typological family.
We'll put each other through boot camp.
No, it's things we had a long series of reading through Heidegger, going to the depths of him, and that is this uncovering and covering. It's a dual principle, and the covering is important for the presencing. So this is the presencing, the covering and the uncovering. And he wanted to get away from the idea of how can I explain it? The idea of something just being there in the light, so to speak, being in the light, and therefore uncovered constantly under fluorescent light. But he meant that the uncovering and the covering is part and principle of the process of becoming, the presencing.
Presencing. Mhm.
And when I read about how you explain it in chapter 5, I was thinking of the backside of the object that is covered, and that's an important detail of what something is or what that becoming is, so to speak.
Okay.
So it needs to be covered, and that covered thing is, so to speak, the subject. Am I somewhat close, or?
Let me think about that. I think my first impression is that you're still dealing with objects there.
Yeah.
The side that's
I
visible.
noticed that when I talked.
What's that?
I noticed that when I talked, I heard the object coming out of my mouth.
Okay. So if you're looking at something and it has a backside that you cannot see and a front side that you do see,
Yeah.
and therefore, even though you cannot see the backside, that's like in object constancy, right? That's a
Yes,
connection
yes,
with
yes.
object. You reach a point where cognitively, if not perceptually, the whole object becomes fleshed out, front and back.
Oh.
So you're taking a little bit of a cognitive step that goes beyond what is immediately perceptible. You see the front, you don't see the other side, but you assume and learn that there is another side that completes the object. My problem is that I don't see subjectivity there. I see the subject's completion of the object.
Yes, yes.
And yes, the subject is required to engage in that cognitive step of completing what cannot be perceived, the other side. So is that the sense you mean?
Yes.
The subject is brought in because the subjectivity is required to complete?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Okay.
Definitely. Oh,
All right. So, and you're relating that to what you see in chapter 5.
yes. And then I began to understand that subjectivity needs to be brought into the equation, so to speak, to finish the objective side, the presencing.
Okay, I'm starting to get it, what you're saying.
It sounds very parallel to Heidegger's covering and uncovering, aletheia and theia.
Yeah, I thought you meant aletheia and...
Aletheia, that's the pronunciation.
Yeah.
Sorry, Steve.
I'm far from an expert on Greek pronunciation. I don't know though, Hans. I'm thinking about whether I would equate. You see, the problem is that, yes, a subject is required to put together what is visible, you would say uncovered, and what is not visible, the far side, the back side, what is covered. But the subject and object are still not integrated. You still have a separate subject standing apart from this object. I can see the front side. I can't see the back side, but I assume that there's a back side. So the object is completed in my understanding, but I, the subject, am still stepping back from that. So there is still a separation of subject and object. And I think with Heidegger, aletheia precedes, comes before the separation of subject and object. So, yeah, it's a distinction between opposing sides of an object, what can be seen and what cannot be seen, a distinction between that and the subject who is viewing and thinking about this object before her. Does that make sense to you, that there would be such a distinction? So I think Heidegger's notion of aletheia is more primordial than that developmental stage when cognition, according to Piaget, when cognition reaches a point where it can now fill in the gap, cognitively fill in the gap of what is perceived. So there's a gap in what I'm perceiving, but I fill it in cognitively, therefore the object is constant. But the subject is still separate from this construct.
In the Piaget thing, definitely. There is a big separation. He inadvertently brings in the Newtonian paradigm, or the line and the square.
Exactly. And Heidegger was trying to question the Newtonian paradigm. And Merleau-Ponty did the same with his concept of depth, of true depth. You know, when Merleau-Ponty writes about it, there's a passage, and I can't quite bring it into focus to the point of being able to quote it verbatim, but he talks about the life world, which was Husserl's original term that Merleau-Ponty adopted for a slightly different use. And he talks about what goes on in the life world. He talks about people viewing each other, but the viewing of each other is so intimate that it becomes unclear who the subject is and who the object is. There's this blending of subject and object in the life world. Perhaps that could be related to Heideggerian aletheia, a blending of subject and object that, you know, I don't think it can be found elsewhere in philosophical thinking. Of course, that's a debatable point, but so what do you think of that? And that's what I was trying to get at with these topological structures.
Yes.
You know, going back to Merleau-Ponty and The Visible and the Invisible, his book, The Visible and the Invisible, his last published book, he talks about topology and just gives a little hint that we may need topology to understand structures like the depth dimension. And so I've developed that in my writing, saying that the topology that we need to understand the dimension of depth is the Klein bottle. And the Klein bottle, in its peculiar way, does merge subject and object. Right? So there isn't a subject standing outside and looking at the completed object. It's subject and object flowing together, paradoxically. It's paradoxical because they are separate and yet they are completely one.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So there isn't this dualistic choice between, oh, they're together, or
No, no, exactly,
they're
That's so
both.
good. Yes, yes.
And that's what these figures introduced in chapter 5 are looking to get at. And for us, it's the Klein bottle. But what I bring out in that writing is that if you go into other areas of nature, the animal world, the vegetable world, or even minerals, there are structures parallel to the Klein bottle, ontological structures, and those structures turn up for us as the Mobius strip,
Yes.
the lemniscate, and what I call the sublemniscate. But the way they turn up for us, they are not ontological paradoxes. They're, the Mobius strip, you can make a Mobius strip in 3 dimensions. You don't need subjectivity to make a Mobius strip.
No, no.
I mean, you don't need the subject to enter the picture. You need somebody thinking, you're putting it together, but the merging of subject and object only in the human sphere, in the 3-dimensional sphere, the merging of subject and object only takes place with the Klein bottle. But if you were to go to more primordial spheres, animal, vegetable, mineral, or in the book you cited, The Self-Evolving Cosmos,
Oh, yeah.
it's the photon, it's light that the Klein bottle embodies. But if you want to go to the other forces of nature, the strong force, the weak force, and gravitation, that's where I'm claiming in this book that the dimensions associated with those other forces, the older forces of nature, strong and weak, and gravitation, those forces are older than light in a certain way, more primordial. And for those, you need lower dimensions that are embodied by the other 3 topological figures. So in this book, there's a chart somewhere, a table.
Yes, I've been looking through the chart today.
It's not easy.
No,
It's not easy.
Tough. Chapter 5.
People have told me this is very challenging, very challenging.
Yes. But it brought some understanding to me, looking into it quite strongly. I really focused on it.
I have this habit of listening to myself as I'm talking and wondering how clearly I'm coming across to the person I'm speaking with. So I have to ask you, because I'm under the impression that what I said about the other dimensions, about the topological figures, about the forces of nature, I'm under the impression that most people find that very difficult. So if you do, and if I've said anything that isn't clear, we can talk about it more.
Thank you. Well appreciated, Steve. Well appreciated. Thank you very much. Means a lot.
Because I don't want to come across like when I took a course in matrix algebra, and I was completely snowed. The instructor of the course gave us a snow job, if you know what that means. So I don't want to give you a snow job. And I think if things are difficult, they have to be worked through. So
Oh,
the
yeah.
snow, so the sun breaks through and the snow stops.
Definitely. That's
It's
how
light, right? The sun is breaking through. The photon.
the photons coming in. But there's a question to that too, and I was thinking of the landscape, and let's see here. This now I'm getting into deeper territory. How do you say deeper waters in my case, where I'm not 100% sure where to trod, but I'll give it a try, and I have a hunch, and there is. If you take a cylinder, for instance, and you feel the edge with your finger, you will not get the whole cylinder. But whereas you put your finger on the media strip, the 2 turns you'll have to take to get back to the same place will cover the entirety of the media strip. So you sort of get the object, or you get into the presence of the subject, you could say, is being.
Well, when you promote the Mobius strip to a Klein bottle and you cover both sides, then you do get the subject.
Oh yeah, definitely. But there is also an inherent movement, and here is what I'm thinking, because in the landscape it is moving, so in a way stillness and movement are not as how do you say, exclusive or excluding one another,
Yeah, mutually
which
exclusive.
is
Yeah.
obviously the case in Newtonian paradigm, where stillness and staticness is on one side, and movement is usually depicted as the timeline in the Newtonian scheme of things, that kept separate. But here in this complete stillness, there seem to be moving as well.
Good point. Yeah, that's right.
It's once more of those that we have this exclusion in Western thinking. It's either or, it cannot be both. And they cannot help each other to be themselves, to be what they really are.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very important dualism to overcome,
Oh,
movement and stasis, and how we divide those in our Newtonian way of operating. And they need to be brought together, yeah.
and that must have been the exact problem of Zeno, the
Yeah,
hare and tortoise or turtle.
yeah.
Which one of those things? We have the
Hare
same
and tortoise.
word.
Yeah, that's right. I never thought of that Zeno's paradox revolves around wanting to separate movement from stasis. Good point.
And I've been thinking where this excludedness or either or process start. And I don't know, I just have guesses, maybe sort of trauma to the Greek thinking, or a development. There've been many guesses. Paul Feyerabend, the Austrian philosopher of science, he thought there was, he was just pointing to, he wasn't sure himself, but he was just pointing to tendencies in Greek culture that could be either causative or a sign of this tendency.
I attended a lecture the other night, and someone was saying, in effect, the speaker was in effect saying that our Newtonian way of functioning originated, I think he said, the 11th century. And I loved his presentation, but I thought that it originated at an earlier point. And one very, very important development in Western culture was the development of alphabetic language with the Greeks. The very structure of the language we're using right now makes it difficult for us to embrace paradigm.
Exactly.
Enforces dualism on us.
Yes.
That's a tremendous challenge. And so I would say that it would go back, the origin of these dualisms would go back at least as far as the Greek development of alphabetic language. I guess Hebrew is also in there. I know you have your colleague is a scholar about these things.
Yes, he is. We've been discussing it. It's just around here, back on me. And one important thing, also mentioned by a British psychiatrist, Ian McGilchrist, is the particular, this is really Western, and that is, you make something that is absolutely clear, that is doesn't have any real cloudiness or ambiguities. You try to make that clearer, and one such development was the putting in of vowels in the system. They never did that in Hebrew or Arabic and most writing systems that I know of. And they did that in Western. That was, so to speak, unnecessary for a practical viewpoint, but it made this idea of exaggerated clarity, the light that I mentioned earlier on, the luminescent light. I always think of these fluorescent lights. Trying to see the distinctions and not accepting the covering, the uncovering. I need to see my hands. The covering and the uncovering, the aletheia and the thea, that those processes, instead having just clarity.
Okay.
In a way, you can say they turn the words into atoms, separated from the rest of the words in a sentence or the whole text. They lost their togetherness, and maybe people start thinking, for a thing to be an individual, a word, it needs to be separated. That can have nothing to do with the rest of the text. That's how I thought about it. That's my take on it.
Yeah. Yes. Language has become an agent of atomizing, turning things into atoms, separate units. And yeah, there may have been alphabetic language probably grew out of languages of poetry and song.
Oh, yeah.
Singing came before prosaic speech, probably.
Yeah. I heard that too. I think that's very sound.
Yeah.
And there is in earlier Greek writing almost something close to that the original writing was almost like going this way.
Mm-hmm.
So it was connected like a long tail. And then you could clearly still feel the language with its togetherness. And where together didn't mean that there was no possibility of separation. And they wrote that in that manner, and then they came with the idea for each new line they had to start over again. And there you go, you have the first separation, and then came a further distinction, putting in like separation between the words and the vowels. They're all separating, unnecessary contributions. Hebrew to this day still doesn't have vowels, and everybody understands, and
Mm-hmm.
Arabic as
Yeah.
well. So, but there's some tendency. I don't know if they're causative or a very good sign of, or a mixture of the both.
Yeah, you've been a scholar of a linguistic scholar,
Yes, I have.
far more than I. I've just picked things up, but I haven't made a very detailed study. So where are you now with your thoughts?
Well, I'm a bit still in a bit of a shock. It seems that your way of approaching things could be a very important key because uh, you make visual or understandable things that couldn't be reached. As you said earlier, we have to use language, and language itself is Western language. It has these tendencies. How do you get around it? And I think when I read chapter 5 and your other books, it's seen that I understand, and that could also be made understandable for others in the book. They are like a new way of seeing these things.
Mm.
And it's a tough nut to crack, I have to admit that. But it's an opening. It's a true opening. It's like Heidegger and Lichtung.
Well, I've been trying to crack this nut for 50 years. I
Yeah.
think I already told you how it is. I know when it all started. I know exactly when it all started. And it's just been over the past 50 years, since the fall of 1972, it's just been this process of unfolding the same thing. Yeah, so it's a long process. And challenging.
Yeah, I can well imagine. Was there any, Steve, do tell me, was there any specific incidents in the fall of 72 that, or what happened in the thinking process that sort of sparked the whole?
Yeah, I may have mentioned to you before that I had just gotten my doctorate in experimental psychology, but I was theoretically and philosophically inclined. I wasn't satisfied with just continuing the same project I'd been working on for my doctoral dissertation. And I got interested in thermodynamics. Did I mention that to you?
No.
Okay. Well, I was interested in um, the exchange of energy, which is a central issue in thermodynamics. I'd read general systems theory at that time. People like von Bertalanffy, Erwin Laszlo, general systems theorists. And so my question was, how do two systems exchange energy? Because everything I'd read seemed unsatisfying to me by way of answering the question of energy exchange. And then I came across a book called 1, 2, 3 Infinity. And in that book, there was a chapter on unusual, something like unusual structures of space. And the author of the book talked about the Klein bottle and the Mobius surface and turning inside out.
Yes.
And this really lit me up because I made a connection between these structures and my question about the exchange of energy. And I thought and said to myself, well, what if energy is exchanged between two systems in the same way that inside and outside weave together in the Klein bottle and the Mobius strip? That was the beginning for me of this whole line of thinking. And it came as a revelation. I was excited. I felt something fundamental had changed in my way of thinking. And it went from there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fall of 72 then.
Yeah, that's right. Quite a trip.
Wow. Yeah, that's
A
incredible.
Mobius trip.
Most definitely. I have some one mentioning and two mentionings from colleagues of mine. One is the co-author, Kalle Lundahl, and he wants to say he's very happy with the idea of your neologism sort of wholeness, where you put the W in parenthesis, where the whole is what produces the whole.
That's another fundamental dualism that has to be challenged. Wholeness, yes.
It's very tough, but the Greek had problem with the Parmenides. Thought everything had to be completely solid and non-existent was didn't exist, so to speak, was impossible.
Well, it was easier for the Taoists.
Oh yeah, most definitely. Most definitely.
That, Hans, that's another dualism that needs to be brought together. Eastern and Western patterns of thought. And we'd probably have to add Northern and Southern as well, because I understand there are some fundamental insights in African thinking and so forth. So yeah.
Yes.
And not only African, but also in the North, indigenous patterns. So to bring those cultures, the indigenous cultures, together with developments in the West, if those could be merged, it would be like Ian McGilchrist talking about left brain and right brain and the need
definitely.
to integrate those.
Yes. Definitely.
So I think that's what you're doing, and that's what I'm doing. Basically, we're trying to create wholeness both with and without the W, in world culture.
Yeah, and Ian McGilchrist with his right hemisphere, it needs to come together, so to speak, and cooperate instead of one demanding the other.
You know.
Oh, indeed.
So there we have it, right?
Oh, very good, very good. We're reaching the 1 hour mark. It was very, very, thank you very much, Steve. We will continue with the studying of your books. I think they really have something extraordinary that makes things unvisualizable, if that's an English term, possible to visualize and understand. Imagine.
You know, along the lines of what you're saying, I know we're reaching the end of our time, but I'm tempted to add to what you just said that my very first publication in this area, which was in 1973, was entitled, a very grandiose title, A Plea for the Possibility of Visualizing Existence.
Oh,
that was the title of that
very
first
good
article in this area.
Very good.
Grandiose, but mirroring what you said. Yeah, so let's do this again sometime. And I appreciate your interest in my work. It's encouraging to me that you're drawn to it and are spending time with it. And that's great. I appreciate it, and we can do more.
Thank you very much. I'll get back to you in some time. I will do some more study, but it was really helpful, your these questions and answer, because then I can feel safe to go further. Otherwise, one could get lost, but now it feels safer to try.
Yeah, good. Well, again, if anything is not clear to you, just be in touch with me and we can talk about it.
Much appreciated, Steve. Thank you very much for taking your time. I mentioned this is recorded now. Would that be okay to publish with your?
Sure. Do with it what you will.
Thank you very much. Have a very pleasant, I imagine, afternoon, or is it morning there still?
Say that again. Say that again.
Have a very pleasant afternoon, or
afternoon. Yes, exactly, and have a very pleasant evening. What remains of your evening? What is it? 9 o'clock now there?
Yeah, it's exactly 9 o'clock there. Well, thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much, Steve. Have a good time.
Bye-bye. Take
Bye.
care.